They burned our Envoy. Humanity burned their sun in return. 9 ships dropped out of the dark, and the enemy laughed at how small they looked. Sovereign-Elector Myradus watched the feed from his balcony, obsidian armor, catching the dying light of his own sun. 1,500 heavy cruisers held the space between the small human fleet and his capital, a wall of metal that had never once failed him. He gave the order to fire without lowering his cup. The cruisers fired. Beams lanced across the dark, bright and certain and useless. The 9 human ships did not dodge. They did not return fire. They opened their hulls and let something small and countless pour out into the black, and every one of those small things turned away from the cruisers, away from the capital, away from every target a warship was built to defend. They turned toward the sun. Myradus set down his cup. For the first time in 18,000 cycles of Dominion rule, an enemy fleet was not aiming at him at all. The feed froze there, in his mind if nowhere else, the tiny lights converging on that one impossible target, and the question that would not leave him alone. What does a warship do when the enemy isn't shooting at it? I wish I could tell you the fleet found an answer in time. It didn't. Stay close. 6 hours earlier, the air in the Grand Spire smelled the way it always did. Burnt metal and bad choices. 94 delegates stood beneath the dark glass dome, packed shoulder to shoulder, none of them looking directly at the fusion dais in the center of the floor. A brass stopwatch sat forgotten in a coat pocket 4 light years away, on a desk that hadn't been touched in an hour. Envoy Sealer's Vane stood alone at the base of the dais. He was not a large man. He wore the plain grey coat of Earth's diplomatic corps, and he had not slept in 2 days, and he kept his hands folded behind his back the way his mother taught him, because a folded hand does not shake. Sovereign-Elector Myradus descended from his throne perch on the upper ring, boots ringing against the brass floor. 94 delegates went still. This was the wrong detail nobody in that room would let themselves notice. Myradus never came down to the floor. He always stayed above, where the acoustics carried his voice like judgment. He was coming down now, and that meant he wanted to be close enough to watch a face change. "Your people will kneel before this convocation," Myradus said. His voice filled the dome without effort. "You will surrender your border colonies within the cycle, or we will take them the way we have taken 94 worlds before yours." Vane did not kneel. He said, in a voice that barely reached the 3rd row, "No." A single word. It should not have carried. It did. Myradus tilted his massive head, the crest of 17 suppressed uprisings catching the dome's cold light. "Say it again, small thing. Say it so the convocation hears you refuse an empire." "No," Vane said again, louder this time, and something in the room seemed to lean forward to catch it. "We won't kneel. Not today. Not ever. You'll have to find another way to feel powerful." That was Hook too. Ask yourself why a man with no weapon, no fleet behind him, no way home, would say that to a room built to break men like him. Myradus's guards moved before the echo of the word died. 2 of them, armored in obsidian scale, closed on Vane from either side and dragged him toward the fusion dais, his heels scraping brass. Arch-Scholar Vela, seated in the scholars' gallery, pressed one hand flat against her mouth. She had never seen an execution done in front of a live convocation feed before. 94 worlds were about to watch what happened to a man who said no. Vane did not fight the guards. He looked up once, past Myradus, into the recording lens above the dais, and said the only thing he had left. "Tell Corbin it's time." That was the whole message. 4 words, aimed at a man 4 light years away who was, at that exact moment, drinking chicory coffee gone lukewarm in a cup he'd forgotten to refill. The dais opened. Light and heat rolled up from beneath the floor. Myradus did not look away, and neither, on the recording, did Vela, though her knuckles had gone the color of bone. Marshal Jace Corbin watched all of it from Aegis Alpha Bastion, alone in a command room built for 40 people, because he'd sent everyone else out an hour ago. He was a broad, quiet man, 28 years in Earth Tactical Command, the kind of officer who never raised his voice, because he'd never needed to. He drank his coffee cold, out of habit, and he did not blink through the feed, not once, not even at the end. When the feed cut to static, Corbin set the cup down without a sound. He reached into his coat and pulled out a heavy brass stopwatch, worn smooth at the edges from 20 years of the same thumb. He pressed the crown. The ticking filled the empty room. That was the wrong detail nobody in Aegis Alpha would understand until much later. Corbin didn't call his tactical staff. He didn't order an alert. He sat with a cold cup and an old watch and did nothing that looked like war. 3 of his junior officers pushed through the door within the minute, already talking over each other, already reading numbers off a tablet that meant nothing to Corbin anymore. He held up one hand and they stopped. "Authorize the Icarus directive," Corbin said. His voice was flat. It was the same voice he used to order coffee. The room went silent in a different way than the Grand Spire had gone silent. One officer, a young man named Tarn who had never once seen the Marshal issue an order without a full briefing, found his voice first. "Sir, the directive isn't a fleet action. It's not built to face their war fleet. It's—" "I know what it's built for," Corbin said. "Authorize it." Nobody argued with him twice. Tarn's hands moved across the console, slow at first, then fast, because the Marshal was already walking toward the door, and men like Corbin did not repeat themselves. Across 4 light years, the Zarvak's dominion did what a wall always does when it senses a threat. It locked its border worlds, doubled patrols along every approach a human fleet would have to take, and waited for the small, angry response every empire had learned to expect from a species it had just insulted in public. Myradus went back to his balcony. He did not think about Vane's 4 words again. He had no reason to. Nobody in the Dominion had ever heard the name Icarus, and a name you have never heard cannot frighten you. 72 hours passed with no human ships at the border. The Dominion's sensor net reported nothing, hour after hour, and somewhere in the lower ranks of Myradus's command a captain began to relax, the way men do when a threatened storm doesn't arrive on schedule. It hadn't gone to the border, it had gone around it. 9 drone carriers, black-hulled and unlit, folded space directly into the heart of the Zarvak's home system, past every patrol, past every ship that had spent 3 days watching the wrong door. They surfaced in the dark above the enemy capital's own sun, close enough that the light of it washed out every star behind them, and for a full 6 minutes, nobody on the ground below knew they were there at all. Myradus was the first to know. A junior officer burst onto his balcony without announcing herself, which alone should have told him something was wrong, and said only, 9 contacts. Close orbit. He laughed. 9 ships. He had 1,500 heavy cruisers holding that exact orbit, more firepower in a single wing than the entire human fleet could field in a decade, and 9 ships had wandered close enough to die for it. He gave the order to intercept before he'd finished his drink. The cruisers moved to meet them. The 9 carriers did not retreat, did not maneuver, did not do anything a warship recognizes as fear. They opened their hulls instead, and the sky filled with something small. We don't fully know yet what came pouring out of those 9 ships, or why every one of those small shapes turned its back on 1,500 warships built to kill it. Marshal Corbin knew. He was watching the same telemetry from Aegis Alpha, his face giving away nothing, the brass stopwatch still ticking in his closed hand. He had been counting for 6 hours already. He had 22 more minutes to go. Myradus's laugh had not fully died in his throat when the first cruiser reported no targets. Not no locks, no targets. The gunnery officer said it twice, thinking his own instruments had failed, because a war fleet cannot process an enemy that isn't shooting back and isn't running. The swarm poured past the cruiser's formation the way water goes around a stone, unbothered, unhurried, entirely uninterested in 1,500 warships that had never once been ignored. "Fire again," Myradus said. He was still smiling. A man does not stop smiling easily after 18,000 cycles of being right. They fired again. Beams found nothing worth hitting, because the swarm was already small and scattering and falling, not at the ships, but past them, down through the high atmosphere of nothing at all, because there was no atmosphere between orbit and a star. They were falling into the sun itself. Arch-Scholar Vela stood at the edge of the scholars' gallery, still watching the same feed she had not looked away from since the fusion dais closed over Vane. She did not understand naval doctrine. She understood, the way anyone understands a held breath, that something was wrong with how the small dark shapes moved. They did not scatter like debris. They moved like they had somewhere to be. "Sovereign Elector," she said, and it was the first time in 11 cycles of service she had spoken to him unprompted. "They are not aiming at the fleet." Myradis did not answer her. He was still watching his cruisers turn, slow and ponderous, chasing targets that no longer cared whether they were chased. The swarm reached the star's outer edge within the hour. It did not explode, or burn, or do anything a weapon is supposed to do. It simply arrived, tens of thousands of small dark points settling against the boiling surface of a sun that had burned steadily for longer than the Dominion had existed, and it began, very quietly, to feed. That was Hook 7. A star does not get eaten. Nobody in that command dome had a word for what they were watching, and the absence of a word was its own kind of alarm. The first sign came 40 minutes later, small enough that most instruments on the Capitol missed it. The light through the dome windows shifted, just slightly, from the gold the city had always known to something a shade paler. A technician on the lower ring noticed it first and said nothing, because who reports a change in sunlight to a sovereign elector? Myradis noticed it himself an hour after that, and this time he did not laugh. He stood at the balcony rail and looked up, past the dome's dark glass, at a sky that had always been the one true constant of his rule. 94 worlds had burned under this light. His father had burned under it, and his father's father, and every sovereign elector back to the founding had stood exactly where Myradis now stood and known, without needing to think about it, that the sun would rise tomorrow the way it always had. It looked different now. Not dimmer, not yet. Different, the way a familiar face looks different a half-second before you realize the person is a stranger. He had believed, without ever once examining the belief, that a species without a war fleet worth the name could not touch him. He had watched their small carriers arrive and counted them, 9 against 1,500, and the math had told him everything he needed to know. The math had been correct. It had also been the wrong question, and he was only now, standing under a sky the wrong shade of gold, beginning to understand that the humans had never planned to answer the question he'd asked. They had answered a different one entirely, one about a star, one he had never thought to ask because no one in 18,000 cycles had ever needed to. "Get me fleet command," he said. His voice had lost the register that filled the dome. It came out smaller than he meant it to. Nobody answered right away. The comms officer was staring at her own readout, where the temperature curve for the outer colonies had begun, almost imperceptibly, to bend downward. Somewhere in the lower city, 400,000 people who had never once thought about their sun went on with an ordinary afternoon. A woman named Isran, who ran a bread stall 3 streets from the spire's outer wall, wrapped a loaf for a customer and remarked, the way people do, that the light seemed thinner today. She had said the same thing 100 mornings before and been wrong every time. She did not know yet that this was the one morning she would be right, and that by evening her stall would be lit by emergency lamps instead of a sky that no longer gave enough of its own light to read by. Corbin watched none of this directly. He watched a single line on a single readout, the fusion output curve of a star 4 light-years away, falling at exactly the rate the Icarus directives models had promised it would. He had not expected to feel anything watching it. He found, instead, that he did not look away either, the same way Vela hadn't looked away from the dais. That was the release, brief and quiet. A man alone with cold coffee and a falling number, doing nothing that looked like victory. The larger peak came fast on its heels. 19 minutes into the drain, the first grid failure hit the Zarvax capital's lower ring, and it did not fail quietly. Lights across 6 districts died at once, plunging streets that had never known true dark into a blackness so total that people stopped walking, afraid of falling, afraid of each other, afraid of nothing they could name yet. Myradis felt the tremor of it through the floor before the report reached him, a shudder as backup systems across the spire fought to compensate and lost. He turned from the balcony to find Vela still standing there, watching him now instead of the sky, and for the first time in 11 cycles, she did not look away when he met her eyes. "You said they weren't aiming at the fleet," he said. "I was wrong," Vela answered. "They were never aiming at anything we could shoot back at. That was the dread bomb, the one Myradis would carry for the rest of whatever life he had left. Not the failing lights, not the falling numbers, but the sudden, total understanding that his entire doctrine, 17 suppressed uprisings and 18,000 cycles of it, had assumed an enemy who fought the way the Dominion fought. He had built a wall to stop an army. The humans had never sent an army at all. They had reached past his wall, past his fleet, past every ship he had ever launched, and put their hand directly on the one thing he had never once thought to defend, because it had never occurred to him that a sun needed defending. He did not order a counterattack. There was nothing left to counter. He stood at the rail with the temperature already dropping around him and understood, in the particular silence that follows a man's worst realization, that he had mistaken the size of his fleet for the size of his safety, and the two had never been the same thing. 1,500 heavy cruisers held their orbit, weapons hot, targeting systems locked on nothing useful at all. A fleet that large had never once needed to ask what it was for. It was asking now, and there was no answer that helped. The rehook came from the lower city, not the spire. A runner from the outer ring pushed into the command dome without clearance, past guards too stunned by their own readouts to stop her, and said the words that would recontextualize everything the convocation delegates thought they had understood about the day. "The eastern farms are already dying," she said. "The crops can't take the cold. We have maybe 6 days of stored grain for the capital." Nobody had been thinking about food. Nobody in a war room ever does, until the war stops being about ships. Myradis looked at her, then at Vela, then back at the sky, and said nothing at all. It was the longest silence the grand spire had held since the dome was built. 4 light years away, Corbin's stopwatch kept ticking, unbothered, exact, counting down toward a number only he knew. He had not moved from his chair in 3 hours. His officers had stopped bringing him updates an hour ago because the updates had stopped changing anything he needed to decide. The directive was running the way it was built to run. All that was left was time, and Corbin had never been a man in a hurry. Tarn found him there, still holding the cold cup, and asked the question every officer in that room wanted answered. "Sir, when does it end?" Corbin looked at the brass watch in his palm, at the second hand sweeping past a number that meant nothing to anyone but him. "When it's supposed to," he said, "not before." Outside Aegis Alpha's viewport, Earth's own sun hung exactly where it always had, warm and unbothered, 4 light years from a sky that would never look the same again. The capital's central bell, silent for 400 cycles because no one had ever needed to ring it, began to toll on its own as its housing froze and cracked. Myradis heard it from the balcony rail and did not move. Below him, the lower ring had gone fully dark, backup power rerouted to the spire's own systems on his direct order, an order he had given without quite admitting to himself what it meant. The capital would freeze in the dark so that he could keep his lights on a little longer. Vela had not left his side since the runner's report. She watched him give that order and said nothing, though something in her face had gone as cold as the air outside the dome. "Sovereign Elector," said Fleet Commander Orath, arriving at a run that no officer of his rank had used in years. "The cruisers are requesting new orders. They are still holding position. They have nothing left to shoot." Myradis turned from the rail. For a moment, Orath thought he might finally give the order to stand down, to bring the useless fleet home, to admit what every reading on every console had already told the room. "Hold position," Myradis said instead. Orath stared at him. "Sir, there is nothing there to hold against." "I know that," Myradis snapped, the first raw edge anyone had heard in his voice all day. "Hold position anyway. I will not have it said that the Dominion's fleet ran from an enemy who never even fired a shot. That was pride talking, not strategy, and everyone in the room understood the difference, even if no one dared say it aloud. 1,500 ships sat in an empty orbit around a dying star, burning fuel they could not spare, defending nothing, because their commander could not bear the shape of the truth. Vela stepped closer to him, closer than protocol allowed. "They are not going to attack the fleet," she said quietly, only for him. "They already won. Keeping the ships out there changes nothing except how much longer we can feed them." He looked at her the way a man looks at a mirror he did not ask for. He did not answer. He did not change the order either, and that silence was its own kind of answer. Down in the frozen dark of the lower ring, Isran the bread seller had closed her stall an hour ago and gone looking for her sister, who worked the night shift at the water purification station 3 streets over. She found the station running on manual pumps, workers taking turns at a hand crank because the automated systems had failed with the grid. Nobody was panicking yet. That would come later, when the stored grain ran thin and the cold kept the crop transports from the eastern farms grounded on iced-over roads. For now, there was only the strange, disciplined quiet of a people who had never once had to work for their light, and were only now learning what that work looked like. That quiet was its own kind of dread, heavier than any alarm. 4 light years away, Corbin finally rose from his chair. He had not slept, had not eaten past the coffee he never finished, and when he stood his knees told him about every one of his 50-some years in a single complaint, he ignored the way he ignored most complaints. He walked to the viewport and looked out at Earth's own sun, warm and steady and entirely unbothered by anything happening 4 light years off. Tarn found him there. "Sir, Command wants to know if we should prep a broadcast, something for the history feeds, a statement." "Not yet," Corbin said. He didn't look away from the window. "There's still time on the clock." That was the mundane beat, small and easy to miss. A tired man looking at a familiar sky, saying almost nothing, while behind him a star 4 light years away kept dying exactly on schedule. It would be the last quiet moment either side got before the day tipped fully into what it was always going to become. Because at that exact hour, on the Grand Spire's lower ring, someone finally said the word nobody in 18,000 cycles of Dominion doctrine had a category for. A young engineer pulled from her bed to help diagnose the failing grid, traced the drain pattern back through every failed relay and arrived, hours later than she should have, at the truth sitting in the readouts the whole time. She brought it straight to Orath, bypassing 3 ranks of protocol because there wasn't time for protocol anymore. "They're not weapons," she said, breathless. "The things in orbit around the star. They're siphons, thermal siphons. They're not destroying anything. They're feeding. Drinking the fusion cycle down, slow, deliberate, like." She stopped, searching for a word that wasn't there in Zavak's military language, because the Dominion had never needed a word for an enemy that ate a sun instead of fighting for one. Orath carried the word to Myradus like it was something that might burn his hands. Thermal siphon. Not a bomb, not a fleet. A patient, grinding appetite that had never once cared whether the Dominion noticed it in time to stop it, because by the time anyone noticed, there was nothing left to stop. Myradus repeated the word once, quietly, and something in his face changed that had not changed at the execution, had not changed at the first grid failure, had not even changed in front of Vela's blunt honesty on the balcony. This was worse than dread. This was understanding. "They planned this before Vane ever stood on my dais," Myradus said. It wasn't a question. Nobody answered it, because everybody in the room already knew it was true, and there was nothing comforting left to say about it. That was the mid-collapse rehook, the loop that would not close until the story's very end. If the directive had been running since before the execution, since before the refusal, since before Vane had ever set foot in the Grand Spire, then nothing that had happened that day had been a response to anything Myradus did. He had not provoked this. He had simply been in the room when it was already scheduled to happen. The execution had changed nothing about the outcome. It had only changed how the humans would talk about it afterward, and Myradus understood, standing there under a sky the wrong color, that his own cruelty had never been the trigger. It had only ever been the excuse. He sat down for the first time since morning, in a chair meant for visiting dignitaries, because his legs would no longer hold the weight of what he now knew. Vela watched him sit, and felt something she had not expected to feel for the man who had ordered Vane's death in front of her without blinking. Not sympathy, exactly, but the particular pity reserved for someone who has just discovered that his entire life certainty was never earned, only never tested. "What do we do?" Orath asked, and it wasn't clear anymore whether he was asking Myradis, or asking the room, or asking no one at all. "We wait," Myradis said. "The same as everyone else in this city is waiting." That answer would have been unthinkable from him that morning. It was, in its own broken way, the first honest thing he had said all day. The eastern farms, already struggling under the cold, lost their last transport route when the road ice thickened past what the crop haulers could cross. The 6 days of stored grain the runner had reported that morning had, by evening, become a number nobody wanted to say out loud, because it was shrinking faster than the light was. Corbin received the update through a single line on his console, relayed from a listening post that had been quietly monitoring Dominion communications since long before the directive launched. He read it once and did not react, because reacting had never been useful to him, and he saw no reason to start now. He looked instead at the brass watch in his hand, at the slow, exact sweep of its second hand, counting down toward the number he had never once told his own staff, not because it was secret, but because some things are only real to the one person carrying them. "How much longer, sir?" Tarn asked, and this time there was something almost gentle in the question, the way a man asks another man if he's all right rather than what the mission's status is. Corbin allowed himself, for just a moment, something that was not quite a smile. "Not long," he said. "It ends when I say it ends, not before that and not 1 second after." Outside, Earth's sun kept its steady, patient light, and 4 light-years away, a different sun kept dimming, exactly on schedule, exactly as planned, exactly as it had always been going to. The bell in the lower ring cracked fully through as Corbin's watch ticked past its final minute. Myradis felt the crack through the floor of the grand spire before Orath's voice reached him, and it did not matter any more. He had stopped flinching at the small failures hours ago. What he had not stopped doing was sitting in the visitor's chair, staring at nothing, turning the engineer's word over and over. Thermal siphon. A patient thing. A thing that had been drinking his son since before Vane ever stood on the dais, since before the word surrender had left his own mouth. Vela stood near the balcony doors, watching him not move, and understood something she had not let herself understand until that hour. The sovereign elector's stillness was not calm. It was a man who had run out of orders that meant anything. 4 light-years away, Corbin's stopwatch reached its final second. He did not announce it. He simply looked down at the brass face, watched the hands align at the number he had carried in his chest for 6 hours, and pressed the crown a second time. The ticking stopped. In the sudden quiet of the command room, that silence was louder than the alert klaxons had been all day. 22 minutes, he said, to no one in particular, and closed his hand around the watch. Tarn looked up from his console. "Sir, the drain has completed. Full output collapse confirmed across the primary and 2 secondary bands." "I know," Corbin said. He set the stopped watch on the console beside his cold cup, side by side, and reached for the comms switch himself, because some messages a marshal does not delegate. The signal went out plain, unencrypted, broadcast wide enough that every receiver still drawing power in the Zarvak's capital would catch it. Corbin did not raise his voice. He had never needed to. "This is Marshal Jace Corbin, Earth Tactical Command. You executed our Env in front of 94 worlds because you believed size was the only language we understood. You had a fleet. We had patience. Your sky is dark because you spent 18,000 cycles building ships and never once thought to ask what happens when someone stops fighting the ships and starts fighting the thing that keeps them running. We didn't come for your cruisers. We came to turn off your lights." He paused, letting the line sit the way he let everything sit, unhurried, exact. You have 6 days of grain and no working transports. That is not a threat. It is math, and we are done giving you anything but math from here on. Decide what you want your empire to look like when the sun comes back. We are not in a hurry to see what you choose. The broadcast ended. He did not wait for a reply, because there was nothing anyone on the other end could say that would change a single number on his side of the drain. In the Grand Spire's command dome, the message played through every open channel at once, and for the second time that day, 94 worlds heard a small thing tell an empire no. Myradus rose from the visitor's chair. His legs held this time, though nothing else in him felt steady. He walked to the balcony rail one last time, past Orath, past the junior officers who would not meet his eyes now, and looked out at a sky gone the color of old iron. "Bring the fleet home," he said. It was the first order all day that cost him nothing to give, because there was nothing left out there worth defending. Orath relayed it. 1,500 cruisers, still holding their pointless orbit, began the long turn back toward a capital with no power to receive them properly. It would take most of them the better part of a day to make port, running dark to save what fuel remained, and every citizen watching from the frozen lower ring would see exactly what a war fleet looks like when it has nothing left to protect. That was the humiliation, and it needed no further staging. A wall of warships limping home in the dark, past people burning furniture for warmth, said more than any tribunal could have. Vela found Myradis still at the rail an hour later. She had gone down to the lower ring herself, against protocol, and come back with frost still clinging to her sleeves and a look on her face that had not been there that morning. "They're rationing water," she said. "The purification station is down to hand pumps. I stood in line behind 3 families waiting for their share." She did not soften it for him. "You executed a man this morning for saying no to you. Tonight, an entire district said no to nothing, and it still froze." Myradis did not answer for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice had none of the register that used to fill the dome. "I thought a fleet was the only shield a ruler needed," he said. "I never once asked what shields the sun." Vela studied him, and there was no comfort in her face, only the flat honesty of someone done pretending otherwise. "Some empires break," she said. "Others just freeze. I don't think you get to choose which one you are anymore." She left him there. It was the last thing she ever said to him directly, and neither of them treated it as anything but true. Back at Aegis Alpha, Corbin finally picked up the cold coffee and drank it, grimacing at the taste out of habit rather than surprise. Tarn watched him do it, and emboldened by the day's strange quiet, asked the question that had been sitting in the room since the broadcast went out. "Do you think they'll rebuild, sir? The Dominion?" Corbin set the cup down. 18,000 cycles doesn't end because one sun dims for a season, he said. It ends because the people underneath it stop believing the story their rulers tell them about why the dark is worth it. That part isn't ours to finish. We just turned off the lights long enough for them to look around. He picked the brass stopwatch back up from the console, turning it once in his palm the way he always had, thumb finding the same worn groove it had worn smooth over 20 years. He did not wind it again. For the first time since anyone in Aegis Alpha had known him, he simply held it, stopped, and put it back in his coat pocket unwound. That was the only version of rest a man, like Corbin, allowed himself. On the eastern farms beyond the Zarvax capital, the frost had already killed most of the standing crop, and the workers who remained gathered by lamplight to salvage what they could before true dark fell. None of them knew Marshal Corbin's name. None of them ever would. They only knew that the sky had gone the wrong color that morning, and that whatever had caused it had not asked their permission first, any more than their own sovereign elector ever had. Isran reopened her bread stall 2 mornings later, working by a single hand-cranked lamp, and sold what little flour she had left to a line of neighbors who did not complain about the price, because complaining had stopped meaning anything useful. She did not know that a marshal 4 light years away had counted 22 minutes on a brass watch to decide the exact shape of her cold morning. She only knew the light through the gap in her stall's awning still looked thin, and that it might stay that way for longer than anyone in the capital wanted to say out loud. The star itself had not died. It would recover slowly, over seasons rather than days, climbing back toward the gold the capital remembered. But recovery was not the same as forgetting, and the Zarvak's dominion would spend a long, cold season learning the difference. Myradus stood alone on the balcony as the last of the returning cruisers limped into dock below, their running lights the only true brightness left in a city that had gone dark to keep them fed. He held no ceremony for their return. There was nothing left to ceremony. He thought of Vane's last words, 4 words meant for a marshal 4 light years away, and understood now that they had never been a threat aimed at him personally. They had simply been true, the way a scheduled thing is true regardless of who happens to be standing in the room when it arrives. 4 light years away, Corbin stood at his own viewport one final time before the long walk to quarters he had not seen in 2 days. Earth's sun sat exactly where it always had, warm, patient, indifferent to the empire it had just outlasted without lifting a single beam in anger. He did not smile. He had never needed to. Somewhere behind him, on the console he had just left, the stopped brass watch sat beside a coffee cup gone cold for the second time that day, its hands locked at 22 minutes, and the city on the other side of the dark kept learning, one frozen morning at a time, exactly what it had cost to make a marshal open his mouth at all. You stole one life. We took your sky.